Most people don't suffer because life is hard. They suffer because they don't understand themselves. They react instead of respond. They feel instead of think. They blame the world for emotions they never learned to control. This audiobook is not about being calm. It's about being dangerously self-aware. If you can understand your emotions, you can command your decisions. If you can command your decisions, no one can control you. Listen carefully, because emotional ignorance is expensive, and today, it ends.
Your emotions are not the problem. Your obedience to them is. Most people wake up and let feelings decide the day. They feel tired, so they slow down. They feel angry, so they explode. They feel insecure, so they seek approval. That is not living. That is reacting. Here is the truth you must accept immediately. Emotions are signals, not commands. They report information. They do not dictate action. You have a choice, always. The moment you confuse emotion with instruction, chaos begins. Your life becomes unstable. Your decisions become inconsistent. Your identity becomes fragile. High performers understand this early. They feel everything, but they obey selectively. That's the key. They don't deny emotion. They don't suppress it. They observe it. Say this to yourself clearly. I feel it, but I don't have to follow it. Repeat it, because this sentence alone can change your entire life. Think about anger. Anger is data. It signals risk, uncertainty, the unknown. But fear is a terrible leader. If fear gives orders, your life becomes small. You avoid difficult conversations. You avoid opportunities. You avoid growth. Fear says, stay safe. Discipline says, move forward anyway. You don't need fear's permission to act. You don't need comfort's permission to grow. You don't need anyone's permission to choose courage. You have a choice. Most people believe emotional intelligence means being calm. That's a misunderstanding. Emotional intelligence means being conscious. Conscious of what you feel, conscious of why you feel it, conscious enough to delay reaction. That delay, that pause, is where power lives. When you pause, emotion loses authority. When you pause, intelligence enters the room. That's the key. Let's be clear about something uncomfortable. If someone can predict your emotional reactions, they control you. If they know what makes you angry, they own you. If they know what makes you insecure, they manipulate you. If they know what triggers you, they steer you. Predictability is weakness, and emotional predictability is the most common weakness of all. High performers work relentlessly to become emotionally unpredictable, not by being fake, but by being regulated. They don't explode on schedule. They don't react on cue. They don't dance when someone presses a button. Why? Because they treat emotions as data, not orders. Here's a practical rule you must start using immediately. Never act on the first emotional impulse. Never. The first impulse is raw, unfiltered, unintelligent. The second thought is where wisdom appears. You feel offended? Pause. You feel excited? Pause. You feel anxious? Pause. This pause is not weakness. It is dominance. You have a choice. Now let's talk about sadness. Sadness is data. It signals loss, disappointment, or unmet expectation. But sadness does not mean stop. It does not mean quit. It does not mean collapse. Too many people build their entire schedule around their mood. If they feel good, they act. If they feel bad, they disappear. That is emotional slavery. Discipline does not ask, "How do I feel?" Discipline asks, "What must be done?" Say it clearly. I feel it, but I don't have to follow it. That's the key. High performers do something most people never learn. They separate internal experience from external behavior. Inside, they may feel doubt. Outside, they execute with precision. Inside, they may feel pressure. Outside, they remain calm and deliberate. This is not hypocrisy. This is mastery. It's not about being fake. It's about being in control. You don't owe the world access to your emotions. You don't need their permission to regulate yourself. You don't need to express everything you feel. Some emotions are meant to be processed privately, not performed publicly. Let's get very practical. Starting today, when an emotion arises, ask 3 questions. What is this emotion trying to tell me? Is this information accurate or exaggerated? What action aligns with my long-term identity, not my short-term feeling? This turns emotion into intelligence. That's the key. Most people think their emotions are their personality. They say, "That's just how I am." That sentence is a confession of laziness. You are not your emotions. You are the one who notices them. And the observer is always more powerful than the impulse. You have a choice. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Your life today is the result of past emotional obedience. Every bad decision, every unnecessary conflict, every missed opportunity. Not because you felt something, but because you followed it blindly. This is not about guilt. This is about responsibility. Once you know this, you cannot unknow it. Emotional discipline is not coldness. It is clarity. It allows you to care deeply without self-destruction. It allows you to act decisively without emotional chaos. It allows you to remain steady while others lose control. And in a world full of reactive people, the calm individual becomes the leader by default. That's the key. Let me say this one last time because repetition builds identity. You feel emotions. You do not obey them. You have a choice. Always. Master this, and everything changes. But awareness alone is not enough. Understanding emotions is the first step. Next, you must understand why the same emotions keep repeating. You've learned not to obey emotion. Now it's time to expose where they come from.
You don't react randomly. You react predictably. And that should concern you, because anything predictable can be controlled. Most people believe their emotional reactions are caused by other people. They say, "He made me angry. She triggered me. That situation forced me to react." That's a lie you've been repeating to protect your ego. No one controls your emotions. They only activate patterns that already exist inside you. That's the key. A trigger is not the cause. A trigger is a revealer. It reveals an untrained emotional reflex. You have a choice. Let's get brutally honest. If the same type of person keeps getting the same reaction out of you, the problem is not the people. The problem is the pattern. Same disrespect, same anger. Same criticism, same insecurity. Same pressure, same anxiety. Different faces, same emotional outcome. That means the issue is internal. And until you accept that, nothing changes. Triggers are stored responses. They are emotional habits. They were built slowly, often unconsciously over years. Maybe you learned to defend yourself aggressively. Maybe you learned to shut down. Maybe you learned to explain yourself excessively. Maybe you learned to seek validation. At some point in your past, that reaction worked. It protected you. It got you relief. It helped you survive. But survival strategies become limitations if never updated. That's the key. What once protected you may now be sabotaging you. Here's the truth most people avoid.
You keep reacting the same way because you haven't replaced the pattern. Awareness alone is not enough. You can know your triggers and still obey them. Knowledge without discipline changes nothing. It's not about knowing your triggers. It's about training a new response. Say it clearly. It's not about awareness. It's about discipline. Let's break this down practically. A trigger follows a simple loop: stimulus, emotion, reaction, regret, over and over again. The brain loves efficiency. It will reuse familiar reactions because they require less energy. That means if you don't consciously interrupt the loop, your nervous system will run it automatically. That's not personality. That's conditioning. You have a choice, but only if you slow the process down. This is why the pause matters so much. The pause breaks the loop. Without the pause, emotion becomes action instantly. With the pause, emotion becomes information. That's the key. Most people never pause long enough to choose differently. They live inside reflex, and reflex creates repetition. Now let's talk about ego. Triggers are often attached to identity. You react strongly where your identity is fragile. Criticism hurts when you secretly doubt yourself. Disrespect hurts when you need validation. Rejection hurts when you fear abandonment. The emotion is loud where the insecurity is deep. That's not an insult. That's a diagnostic tool. Your strongest emotional reactions point directly to your weakest internal structures. If you're willing to study them instead of defending them, you gain power. You have a choice. High performers do something very different from everyone else. They analyze their reactions like data. After an emotional moment, they ask, what exactly set me off? What story did I tell myself in that moment? Why did I need to react that way? No judgment, no self-hate, just observation. That's the key. They don't say, that's just who I am. They say, that's what I haven't trained yet. Let's address something uncomfortable. If you say, I can't help it, you are giving up your authority. That sentence removes responsibility, and responsibility is the price of control. You don't need to be perfect, but you do need to be honest. You can help it. You just haven't practiced helping it. There's a difference. Here's a rule you must adopt immediately. Every trigger is an invitation to train, not to explode, not to explain, not to retreat, to train. The moment you feel triggered, say internally, this is familiar, this is old, I've been here before. That awareness alone weakens the pattern. Then you pause. Then you choose a response that aligns with who you are becoming, not who you were. You have a choice. Now let's talk about repetition. Triggers don't disappear after one calm response. They weaken through consistent non-reaction. The nervous system learns through repetition. Every time you choose not to obey the trigger, you send a message to your brain. This pattern is no longer needed. That's how rewiring happens. Not through motivation, through discipline. Say it again. It's not about motivation, it's about discipline. Most people wait for triggers to stop appearing. They won't. Life will always test your weakest points. The goal is not to eliminate triggers. The goal is to outgrow them. When you outgrow a trigger, the situation remains the same, but your reaction disappears. That's mastery. Here's a simple daily practice. At the end of the day, ask yourself, what triggered me today? How did I respond? What response would represent my higher self? Write it down mentally or physically. No excuses, no stories. This turns emotional chaos into a training program. That's the key. Let's make something clear. The world does not reward emotional honesty. It rewards emotional regulation. Calm people are trusted. Stable people are promoted. Controlled people are respected. Not because they feel less, but because they choose more carefully. You don't need anyone's permission to change your reactions. You don't need to announce your growth. You don't need validation for discipline. You have a choice. Triggers only control you when they're unconscious. Once seen, they weaken. Once interrupted, they fade. Once replaced, they disappear. But replacement requires identity. You must decide who you are becoming, because the old you will always react the old way. And that brings us forward. You now understand that emotions are not orders. You now see that triggers are trained patterns. Next, you must build something stronger than impulse. You mastered awareness. Now let's talk about the foundation that holds everything together. Most people think power is loud. They think power is confidence. They think power is dominance, speed, expression. They are wrong. Real power is awareness. Self-awareness is the ability to see yourself clearly, in real time, under pressure, without excuses. And almost no one has it. That's why it's a superpower. Look around you. People speak without thinking, react without pausing, defend without understanding. They are not choosing. They are running programs. They believe they are in control because they feel strongly, but intensity is not control. Intensity is often the absence of it. You have a choice. And self-awareness is what creates that choice. That's the key. Self-awareness is not self-criticism. It is not self-hate. It is not endlessly analyzing your past. Self-awareness is seeing what is happening inside you as it happens. I'm getting defensive. I'm seeking approval right now. I'm reacting because my ego feels threatened. No judgment, just recognition. The moment you can name a behavior, you stop being owned by it. Say this clearly. If I can see it, I can stop it. That's the key. Most people live inside their emotions. Self-aware people stand outside them. They don't say, I am angry. They say, anger is present. That difference matters. One makes you the emotion, the other makes you the observer, and the observer always has leverage. You have a choice. Let's be direct. If you are not self-aware, you are easy to manipulate. Flattery works on you. Criticism destabilizes you. Pressure rushes you. Not because you are weak, but because you are unconscious. Unconscious people think they are making decisions. They are not. They are reacting to internal noise. That's not freedom. That's autopilot. Self-awareness slows life down, not externally, internally. The world can move fast, people can push, situations can escalate, but inside you remain clear. That internal clarity is dominance. That's the key. Here's the truth no one wants to hear. You cannot change what you refuse to notice. Most people want growth without observation. They want confidence without reflection. They want control without awareness. It doesn't work that way. Awareness comes first. Always. You don't fix what you don't see. You don't master what you deny. You have a choice. High performers train self-awareness intentionally. They don't wait for moments of crisis to learn about themselves. They study themselves daily. They notice patterns. When I'm tired, I get impatient. When I'm insecure, I talk too much. When I feel challenged, I interrupt. This is not weakness. This is intelligence. That's the key. Let's talk about ego. Ego hates awareness because awareness exposes inconsistency. It reveals contradictions. It shows you where your self-image doesn't match your behavior. That's uncomfortable. So most people avoid it. They distract themselves. They justify themselves. They blame others. But avoidance has a cost. Every time you avoid awareness, you strengthen the pattern you want to escape. It's not about comfort. It's about discipline. Say it again. It's not about comfort. It's about discipline. Here's a practical rule. If something emotionally bothers you, study it, not the person who caused it. The emotion is the message. The situation is just the delivery method. Ask yourself, why did this hit me? What belief did this challenge? What expectation was violated? This turns emotional pain into insight. That's the key. Most people waste energy trying to control the external world. Self-aware people control the internal response. They know something critical. You cannot control what happens, but you can control how much authority it has over you. And that control starts with awareness. You have a choice. Let's talk about the most dangerous illusion of all. Self-awareness means I already know myself. No, that's complacency. Self-awareness is not a destination. It's a practice. You don't become self-aware once. You return to awareness repeatedly, daily, moment by moment. That's why most people lose it under pressure. They never trained it when things were calm. Here's another uncomfortable truth. The louder your emotions, the less aware you are in that moment. That doesn't make you bad, it makes you human. But it does mean this: when emotion spikes, awareness must increase or control disappears. That's the key. High performers develop an internal habit. They constantly ask, what's happening inside me right now? Not obsessively, not anxiously. Calmly, neutrally. That simple question interrupts unconscious behavior. It brings you back into command. You have a choice. Self-awareness also protects you from self-deception. It stops you from lying to yourself about why you did something. I wasn't busy, I was avoiding. I wasn't honest, I was reactive. I wasn't passionate, I was insecure. Truth gives you leverage. Lies take it away. That's the key. Let's be clear. Self-awareness will cost you comfort. It will expose habits you don't like. It will force responsibility. But it will give you something far more valuable. Control. And control creates freedom. Not freedom to do whatever you feel, freedom from being controlled by what you feel. You don't need anyone's permission to become self-aware. You don't need applause for discipline. You don't need validation to observe yourself honestly. You have a choice. Here's a daily practice you must adopt. At least once a day, pause and ask, what am I feeling? Why? What would my highest self do next? No rush, no drama. This trains awareness under normal conditions, so it's available under pressure. That's the key. Self-awareness is not flashy. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't perform. But it quietly separates leaders from reactors, strategists from emotional participants, and masters from victims of impulse. And once you have it, everything else becomes trainable. You now understand your emotions. You see your triggers. You are building awareness. Next, you must understand what all of this is anchored to, because awareness without identity is unstable. You've learned to see yourself clearly. Now let's talk about what that self is built on.
Your emotions do not exist in isolation. They are shaped, contained, limited, or unleashed by your identity. This is where most people get trapped. They try to control emotions without ever questioning who they believe they are. And that never works. Because identity is the container, emotion is the content. That's the key. If your identity is fragile, your emotions will be extreme. If your identity is unstable, your emotions will swing violently. If your identity is unclear, your emotions will run the show. This is not psychology. This is structure. You have a choice. Most people build identity accidentally. They absorb it from childhood, from trauma, from past failures, from labels placed on them by other people. I'm sensitive. I'm hot-headed. I'm just emotional. That's how I am. Those are not facts. Those are identities you accepted without question. And once identity is accepted, emotion follows automatically. That's the key. Let's be direct. Weak identity creates emotional chaos. Why? Because when you don't know who you are, every emotion feels like a threat. Criticism feels like an attack. Disagreement feels like rejection. Silence feels like disrespect. So you react, you defend, you explain, you explode.
Not because the situation is dangerous, but because your identity is unprotected. You have a choice. Strong identity changes everything. When you know who you are, emotions lose intensity. Not because you feel less, but because nothing needs to be proven. You don't argue to protect your ego. You don't overreact to defend your image. You don't chase validation to confirm your worth. That's the key. Strong identity shortens emotional reactions. Here's the truth most people miss. Your emotional range expands or contracts based on identity strength. If your identity is small, every emotion feels overwhelming. If your identity is solid, emotions pass through without damage. It's not about becoming numb, it's about becoming anchored. Say it clearly. It's not about suppressing emotion, it's about strengthening identity. Let's talk about why emotional people take everything personally. Because their identity is built on external approval. When approval disappears, identity shakes, so emotion spikes. Anger, insecurity, anxiety, they all come from the same place, a shaky sense of self. That's the key. High performers define themselves internally. They decide who they are before the world reacts. They don't ask, do they respect me? They ask, did I act according to my standards? They don't ask, how do I look? They ask, did I execute? This internal identity creates emotional stability. You have a choice. Let's expose a dangerous belief. I need to express my emotions to be authentic. No, you need to understand them to be intelligent. Authenticity without discipline is emotional leakage. You don't need to show every feeling. You don't need to perform vulnerability. You don't need to explain your inner world to earn legitimacy. Your identity is not up for negotiation. That's the key. Identity answers one question. Who am I when emotions arise? If the answer is unclear, emotion fills the gap. That's why insecure people feel everything intensely. Emotion becomes their identity. But disciplined people reverse this. Identity leads, emotion follows. Say it again. Identity leads, emotion follows. Here's a practical exercise. Define your identity in behavioral terms, not emotional ones. Not, I am confident, but I act calmly under pressure. Not, I am strong, but I do what needs to be done regardless of mood. Behavior-based identity shrinks emotional chaos. That's the key. Most people try to manage emotions directly. That's exhausting. Strong people manage standards. Standards decide behavior. Behavior reinforces identity. Identity regulates emotion. This is the hierarchy. Break it, and emotion takes over. Honor it, and discipline becomes automatic. You have a choice. Let's make this uncomfortable. If your emotions constantly overwhelm you, your identity is underdeveloped. That's not an insult, it's a diagnosis, and diagnoses are useful because they tell you where to train. It's not about being broken, it's about being unfinished. That's the key. High performers ask one powerful question daily. Who am I training myself to become? Not emotionally, behaviorally. They know this truth. The stronger the identity, the calmer the emotional baseline. You don't need perfect control. You need a clear self-concept. Here's what you must stop doing immediately. Stop describing yourself by emotions. Stop defending emotional reactions as personality. Stop saying, that's just how I am. That sentence keeps you trapped. Replace it with this, that's what I'm training out. You have a choice. Identity is built in moments of intensity. It is built in moments of consistency. How you show up when no one is watching. How you respond when nothing is urgent. How you behave when emotion is low. That's where identity hardens. That's the key. Once identity strengthens, something powerful happens. Emotions still appear, but they don't dominate. Anger visits, but leaves quickly. Fear speaks, but doesn't decide. Sadness informs, but doesn't stop progress. This is emotional maturity, not emotional absence, emotional command. You now understand something critical. Emotions are data. Triggers are patterns. Awareness creates space. Identity creates stability. But there's still a cost you haven't fully faced.
Because emotional ignorance doesn't just feel bad, it destroys outcomes. And that's what we confront next. You've built awareness. You've strengthened identity. Now let's talk about the price of not doing this sooner.
Emotional ignorance is not harmless. It is expensive. And most people are paying for it every day without ever seeing the bill. They think their problems come from bad luck, from unfair people, from difficult circumstances. No. Most damage in life comes from unmanaged emotion. That's the key. Emotional ignorance means you feel first and think later. It means you react and then deal with consequences. It means you let temporary emotion make permanent decisions, and those decisions compound. You have a choice. Let's talk about the real costs. Emotional ignorance costs you relationships. You say things you can't take back. You escalate situations that required calm. You turn small misunderstandings into permanent distance. Not because you meant harm, but because you lacked regulation. People don't leave because you feel deeply. They leave because you react carelessly. That's the key. Emotional ignorance costs you respect. The world does not reward emotional honesty. It rewards emotional stability. When you explode, people remember. When you panic, people notice. When you overreact, people adjust how they deal with you. Not consciously, instinctively. They share less. They trust less. They take you less seriously. You don't lose respect all at once. You leak it emotionally. You have a choice. Emotional ignorance costs you opportunity. You miss chances because fear speaks too loudly. You avoid growth because discomfort feels dangerous. You quit early because emotion convinces you it's rational. Every time you obey emotion, you reinforce limitation. Every time you delay discipline, you shrink your future. It's not about talent, it's about tolerance for emotional discomfort. That's the key. Let's be brutally honest. Many people are not stuck, they are emotionally undisciplined. They want different outcomes with the same emotional habits. That never works. Your emotional habits decide your ceiling. Say it clearly. My habits decide my outcomes. Emotional ignorance costs you clarity. When emotions run high, thinking becomes distorted. You catastrophize, you personalize, you assume intent. You see threats where none exist. You miss solutions because you're busy reacting. This is how smart people make stupid decisions. Not because they lack intelligence, but because emotion hijacked it. That's the key. Emotional ignorance costs you time. You replay conversations, you relive moments, you argue internally with people who aren't even present. Hours, days, years, wasted on emotional noise. Time is your most valuable asset, and emotional chaos bleeds it away quietly. You have a choice. Let's talk about regret. Regret is not caused by failure. It's caused by uncontrolled emotion. You regret what you said in anger. You regret what you didn't do out of fear. You regret how you behaved under pressure. Regret is emotion's receipt, and it always arrives late. That's the key. High performers understand something early. Emotion always sends the bill. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it always collects. They don't wait for regret to teach them. They learn through observation and discipline. They pay attention early so they don't pay heavily later. You have a choice. Let's expose a common lie. I'll work on emotional control when life calms down. Life never calms down. Pressure increases. Expectations rise. Responsibility multiplies. If you don't train emotional discipline now, you'll collapse later. It's not about waiting for easier conditions. It's about becoming stronger under current ones. That's the key.
Emotional ignorance also costs you self-respect. Every time you promise yourself restraint and break it emotionally, your confidence erodes. You stop trusting yourself. You say, "I'll stay calm next time," and then you don't. Over time, that damages your identity. Self-respect is built by keeping internal promises, and emotional discipline is one of the most important ones. You have a choice. Let's talk about leadership, even if you don't think of yourself as a leader. People mirror emotional energy. If you are reactive, your environment becomes reactive. If you are calm, others stabilize. If you are unpredictable emotionally, people walk on eggshells or disengage. Leadership begins with emotional regulation. Not titles, not authority, stability. That's the key. Here's the most dangerous cost of all. Emotional ignorance makes you controllable. Anyone who can trigger you can steer you. Anyone who can provoke you can distract you. Anyone who can flatter you can manipulate you. This is not theory, this is reality. Emotional discipline is not self-help, it's self-defense. You have a choice. Most people don't fail because they lack motivation. They fail because they lack emotional control when motivation fades. Emotion is ephemeral. Discipline is structural. Say it clearly. It's not about motivation, it's about discipline. That's the key. Let's be clear about responsibility. Once you understand the cost, ignorance is no longer an excuse. You may not have been taught emotional discipline, but now you are accountable for learning it. That's not punishment, that's power. Because responsibility returns control to you. You have a choice. Here's a simple exercise you must adopt. At the end of every emotionally charged situation, ask, what did this emotion cost me? Did it move me forward or backward? What would discipline have saved? Do this honestly. This builds consequence awareness, and awareness changes behavior. That's the key. Emotional ignorance keeps you busy but not effective. You feel a lot but build little. Emotional intelligence reverses that. You feel but you choose. You experience but you decide. You sense but you don't surrender. And that difference determines outcomes. Let me say this plainly. You cannot afford emotional ignorance anymore. Not in your relationships, not in your work, not in your future. The cost is too high. The returns are too low. And now you see it. You understand the price. You felt the losses. You know what unmanaged emotion destroys. Now comes the most important skill of all. The one that saves time, protects identity, and prevents regret. You've seen the cost. Now it's time to learn where power actually lives.
Power is not in speed. It is in control. And control is born in one place, the pause. Most people never pause. They react instantly and call it honesty. They speak immediately and call it confidence. They act fast and call it strength. It's not strength, it's exposure. Because anything that reacts instantly is being controlled by impulse. That's the key. The pause is the space between stimulus and response, between what happens and what you do about it. And in that space, everything changes. Without the pause, emotion commands you. With the pause, you command yourself. You have a choice. Let's be clear. Speed feels powerful, but speed without control is reckless. Fast reactions feel decisive until the consequences arrive. The pause feels uncomfortable until you realize it saves you from regret. High performers understand this early. They don't rush responses. They don't answer immediately. They don't move just because something moved them. They pause. That's the key. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The faster you react, the less intelligent the response. Because intelligence requires processing, and processing requires time, even a few seconds.
Most people steal that time from themselves. They hand it to emotion. You have a choice. Think about every moment you regret. You spoke too quickly. You sent the message too fast. You responded before thinking. Regret is rarely caused by inaction. It is caused by unfiltered action. The pause filters action. That's the key. The pause is not silence for silence's sake. It is strategic delay. It allows emotion to settle. It allows logic to enter. It allows identity to lead. Without the pause, you are reacting as the old version of yourself. With the pause, you respond as who you are becoming. You have a choice. Let's address a common fear. People worry that pausing makes them look weak, uncertain, unprepared. That belief comes from insecurity. In reality, the opposite is true. Calm pauses project authority. Measured responses signal confidence. Stillness unsettles emotional people. Why? Because most people expect speed. They expect reaction. They expect predictability. The pause breaks that expectation. That's the key. If someone insults you and you pause, they lose momentum. If someone pressures you and you pause, they lose leverage. If someone rushes you and you pause, you regain control. The pause rebalances power instantly. You have a choice. High performers use a simple rule: never respond emotionally in real time. Real-time emotion is raw, incomplete, biased. They let the emotion arrive, they feel it, but they don't act on it immediately. They wait until clarity replaces intensity. That's the key. Let's talk about pressure. Pressure speeds people up. It compresses time. It forces reaction. That's why pressure reveals character. Untrained people panic. Trained people slow down. They breathe. They observe. They pause. Not because they don't feel pressure, but because they don't surrender to it. You have a choice. The pause is where identity speaks. Emotion says, react now. Identity says, wait, choose correctly. If identity is weak, emotion wins. If identity is strong, the pause grows longer. And in that pause, discipline takes over. That's the key. Let's make this practical. When something triggers you, do this immediately. Stop speaking. Slow your breathing. Name the emotions silently. Anger, fear, insecurity, excitement. Naming it creates distance. Distance creates control. Then ask one question: what response serves my long-term identity? Not your mood, not your ego, your identity. You have a choice. Most people confuse pause with hesitation. They think pausing means they're unsure. No, pausing means you are deliberate. Hesitation comes from fear. Pause comes from discipline. Fear freezes. Pause clarifies. That's the key. Here's something most people never realize. The pause is a skill, and like any skill, it improves with practice. At first, the pause feels forced, unnatural, awkward. That's because you've spent years reacting instantly. But over time, the pause becomes automatic. Emotion rises, pause appears. Trigger hits, pause engages. That's mastery. High performers don't wait for big moments to practice the pause. They train it daily, in small irritations, minor delays, low-stakes conversations. Why? Because you don't rise to the occasion, you fall to your training. If you don't practice pausing when things are calm, you won't pause when things are intense. That's the key. Let's talk about silence. Silence is a form of pause, and silence makes emotional people uncomfortable. Why? Because they rely on noise to dominate. They rely on reaction to feel in control. When you stay silent, you force them to sit with their own emotion. Silence shifts pressure. You don't need to fill every gap. You don't need to respond immediately. You don't need to explain yourself. You don't need their permission to pause. You have a choice. The pause also protects you from manipulation.
Manipulators rush you. They create urgency. They push emotional buttons. The pause breaks their strategy. No urgency survives calm delay. No manipulation survives awareness. That's the key. Here's a powerful truth. The pause is where self-respect is built. Every time you pause instead of reacting, you keep a promise to yourself, and each kept promise strengthens identity. Each broken promise weakens it. Discipline compounds. You have a choice. Let me say this clearly. The pause will cost you comfort in the moment, but it will save you pain later. It may feel uncomfortable to stay silent, to not react, to not defend, but comfort is temporary. Consequences are permanent. The pause protects you from permanent damage. That's the key. Most people live emotionally exhausted because they never pause. They are constantly reacting, constantly processing consequences, constantly repairing damage. The pause reduces workload. It makes life quieter, cleaner, more controlled. Let's anchor this. Emotion arrives, you pause, you choose. That sequence must become automatic. Not because you want peace, but because you want power. Power over yourself, power over outcomes, power over direction. You have a choice. You've now learned where power lives. Not in dominance, not in aggression, not in speed, in the pause. But the pause is only effective if you know what to do inside it, because silence without clarity is just delay. So next, we sharpen what happens in that space. You've learned to pause. Now it's time to learn what to do while others are still reacting.
Control doesn't begin with force. It begins with predictability. And emotional people are predictable. That's why they are easy to control. This is uncomfortable, but necessary. If someone can anticipate your emotional reaction, they don't need power over you. They already have it. That's the key. Emotional people believe intensity equals strength. They think expressing everything makes them real. They think reacting quickly makes them dominant. It does the opposite. Reaction reveals position. Reaction reveals weakness. Reaction reveals leverage. You have a choice. Let's be very clear. Anyone who can make you angry on command owns your attention. Anyone who can make you insecure controls your behavior. Anyone who can rush you emotionally directs your decisions. This is not manipulation theory. This is basic human dynamics. Emotion is a handle. Handles are meant to be pulled. That's the key. Emotional people advertise their buttons. They talk about their triggers. They justify their reactions. They defend their emotional habits as personality. I just don't tolerate disrespect. I'm very sensitive. I react when I care. Those statements are not boundaries. They are instructions. They tell the world exactly how to move you. You have a choice. Let's talk about predictability. Predictability feels safe internally, but externally it's dangerous. If people know what makes you react, they know how to distract you, manipulate you, provoke you, neutralize you. Calm people are hard to read, hard to rush, hard to manipulate. That's the key. High performers understand something critical. Control flows toward the calmest person in the room, not the loudest, not the angriest, not the most expressive, the calmest. Why? Because calm people don't leak information. They don't reveal insecurity. They don't reveal urgency. They don't reveal emotional pressure. They observe while others expose themselves. You have a choice. Emotional people confuse reaction with authenticity. They say, I'm just being real. No, you're being transparent. And transparency without discipline is vulnerability without protection. You don't need to hide emotions. You need to regulate them. There's a difference. That's the key. Let's examine how control actually happens. Control happens when someone insults you and you explode, someone pressures you and you rush, someone withholds approval and you chase.
Each reaction gives them data. Each reaction gives them leverage. Soon, they don't even need to try. They just press the familiar button. You have a choice. Here's an uncomfortable truth. Most people are not controlled by others. They are controlled by their own emotional habits. Other people simply take advantage of what's already there. If you're easily offended, offense becomes a weapon. If you're validation hungry, approval becomes currency. If you're conflict avoidant, pressure becomes leverage. That's the key. High performers work to become emotionally unreadable. Not cold, not detached, unreadable. You don't know what bothers them. You don't know what excites them. You don't know what pressures them. Why? Because they don't react on impulse. They pause. They observe. They decide. You have a choice. Let's talk about emotional speed. Fast emotions are easy to steer. Slow emotions require effort. That's why manipulative people try to rush you. Decide now. Answer immediately. React before thinking. Urgency is emotional pressure. The pause destroys urgency. That's the key. Emotional people also struggle with boundaries. They over-explain, they over-defend, they over-justify. Why? Because emotion demands validation. Calm people don't explain themselves emotionally. They let behavior speak. Silence confuses manipulators. Boundaries frustrate them. You don't need their permission to stay composed. You have a choice. Let's make this practical. If someone tries to provoke you, do not react, do not explain, do not escalate. Pause. Acknowledge internally. Respond minimally or not at all. This removes their leverage. They wanted emotion. They got discipline. That's the key. Emotional people believe control comes from expression. It doesn't. Control comes from containment. When you contain emotion, you force others to deal with uncertainty. They don't know where you stand. They don't know how you'll respond. They don't know how to move you. Uncertainty shifts power. You have a choice. Here's a powerful realization. The less you react, the more others reveal. They fill the silence. They expose their motives. They show their insecurities. Calm becomes a mirror, and mirrors make emotional people uncomfortable. That's the key. Let's address ego. Ego wants to react. It wants to prove. It wants to defend. Discipline wants to win long term. Ego asks, how do I look right now? Discipline asks, what outcome does this create? One reacts, the other controls. You have a choice. Emotional control does not mean passivity. It means selective response. You respond when it benefits you. You stay silent when it doesn't. You act when timing is correct. That selectivity makes you difficult to manipulate. That's the key. Let me say this clearly. If you want to be uncontrollable, you must become emotionally disciplined. Not expressive, not reactive, not predictable. Disciplined. The world doesn't need to fear you to respect you. It needs to be unable to move you. You now understand why emotional people are easy to control. Because emotion reveals leverage. Because predictability invites manipulation. Because reaction surrenders authority. And you are no longer playing that game. You've learned to pause. You've learned to stay unreadable. You've learned to keep control. Now it's time to sharpen one of the most misunderstood tools of power. You've stopped reacting. Now let's talk about what replaces reaction.
The more you explain yourself, the less power you have. That sounds harsh, but it's true. Explanation is often not clarity, it's leakage. And emotional people leak constantly. That's the key. Most explanations are not about being understood, they are about being validated. You explain because you want agreement. You explain because you want relief. You explain because silence makes you uncomfortable. But comfort is not the goal. Control is. You have a choice. Let's be clear. People who explain too much are negotiating their identity. They want others to approve their decisions, understand their feelings, justify their actions. That gives authority away. Because the moment you explain emotionally, you invite judgment. You turn your internal world into a debate. That's the key. High performers do not rush to explain themselves. They act, they observe, they let outcomes speak. They understand a simple truth. Those who matter don't need explanations. Those who demand them are testing control. You have a choice. Let's talk about why explaining feels necessary. It comes from insecurity. When identity is weak, you want reassurance that you're right. When self-trust is low, you want external confirmation. So you talk, you justify, you over-clarify. But every extra word weakens your position. Silence would have been stronger. That's the key. Observe what happens when you stop explaining. People reveal themselves. Some get uncomfortable. Some get aggressive. Some try harder to provoke reaction. Why? Because explanation was their leverage. Without it, they lose control. You have a choice. Most people fear being misunderstood. But misunderstanding is not dangerous. Being manipulable is. You don't need everyone to understand you. You need to understand yourself and act in alignment. That's the key. Let's address a common mistake. People confuse explanation with communication. They are not the same. Communication is clear and minimal. Explanation is emotional and defensive. Communication states facts. Explanation justifies feelings. One is strength, the other is exposure. You have a choice. Here's a powerful shift. Say less, watch more. When you stop explaining, you gain data. You see who respects boundaries. You see who pushes. You see who only stays when they can control. Observation gives you leverage. That's the key. Emotional people talk themselves into traps. They reveal doubts. They expose insecurities. They give manipulators a map. Calm people don't provide maps. They observe quietly. They listen for tone, not words. They notice behavior, not promises. You have a choice. Let's make this practical. When challenged, do this. Do not defend immediately. Do not justify emotionally. Do not overtalk. Pause. Respond with clarity or silence. I've decided. I understand your view. I'll think about it. Short, neutral, controlled. That's the key. Silence is not weakness. Silence is pressure. It forces the other person to sit with uncertainty. It removes their emotional advantage. People who rely on reaction hate silence because silence removes feedback. You don't need their permission to be silent. You have a choice. Let's talk about observation. Observation is active power. When you observe instead of explain, you learn. Who respects you? Who challenges you? Who tries to dominate emotionally? This information is invaluable. You cannot get it while talking. That's the key. High performers use explanations sparingly. They explain once, clearly if needed, then they stop. They don't repeat themselves. They don't argue emotionally. They don't try to convince unwilling listeners. They understand. Convincing is not control. Alignment is. You have a choice. Most people exhaust themselves emotionally because they keep trying to be understood by people who benefit from misunderstanding them. That's not communication. That's self-betrayal. You don't owe everyone clarity. You owe yourself discipline. That's the key. Let's address ego again. Ego wants the last word. Ego wants to be right. Ego wants recognition. Discipline wants results. Ego explains. Discipline observes. One feeds emotion, the other feeds intelligence. You have a choice.
Here's a truth that will change your behavior. The less you explain, the more your actions matter. When words disappear, behavior becomes the language, and behavior is harder to manipulate. That's the key. People respect what they cannot easily influence. If you are emotionally transparent, you are easily influenced. If you are observant and contained, you become difficult to move. Not cold, not distant, deliberate. You have a choice. Let's anchor this. Stop explaining your feelings. Stop justifying your boundaries. Stop narrating your internal world. Observe. Watch how people respond to limits. Watch who stays calm. Watch who escalates. That observation tells you everything you need to know. When you stop explaining, you stop negotiating your worth. You act from identity, not emotion. You choose from discipline, not validation. And something powerful happens. Your mind becomes quieter. Your presence becomes heavier. Your decisions become cleaner. That's the key. You've learned to pause. You've learned to stay unreadable. You've learned to observe instead of explain. Now it's time to apply this where most people fail completely. Because emotional control matters most when conflict appears. You've stopped explaining. Now let's talk about how emotional intelligence decides winners and losers.
Conflict is not a problem. Uncontrolled emotion is. Most people don't lose conflicts because they're wrong. They lose because they lose control. They raise their voice. They rush their words. They let emotion choose the tone, the timing, the outcome. That's the key. Conflict doesn't reward intensity. It rewards regulation. You have a choice. Let's destroy a common myth. Winning conflict is not about domination. It's not about volume. It's not about being more aggressive. That's how emotional people fight. Intelligent people manage the environment. They manage pace. They manage tone. They manage themselves. And the one who manages themselves always has the upper hand. That's the key. Here's the first truth you must accept. The moment you become emotional, you give the other person leverage. Anger narrows your thinking. Fear rushes your decisions. Defensiveness blinds your listening. You may feel powerful, but you are exposed. You have a choice. Emotional intelligence in conflict begins with one principle: slow everything down. When the other person speeds up, you slow down. When they escalate, you lower your tone. When they interrupt, you pause. Speed favors impulse. Slowness favors control. That's the key. Most people mirror emotion in conflict. Anger meets anger. Volume meets volume. Disrespect meets disrespect. This feels natural. It feels fair. It is also predictable. Predictability is weakness. High performers do not mirror emotion. They counterbalance it. They bring calm into chaos. And calm destabilizes emotional aggression. You have a choice. Let's talk about listening. In conflict, emotional people listen to respond. Intelligent people listen to understand structure. They listen for what is actually being said, what fear is underneath, what outcome the other person wants. This is not empathy. This is strategy. Understanding gives you options. Reaction removes them. That's the key. Here's a powerful rule to use in conflict. Never argue facts with someone who is emotional. Facts bounce off emotion. When emotion is high, logic is inaccessible. Trying to prove something in that state only escalates conflict. Instead, regulate the environment first. Lower the emotional temperature, then speak. You have a choice. Let's address ego again. Ego wants to win the moment. Discipline wants to win the outcome. Ego says, "I'll show them."
Discipline says, "I'll control this." Ego reacts to disrespect. Discipline observes it. One explodes, the other dominates quietly. That's the key. Here's what emotional intelligence looks like in real conflict. You don't interrupt. You don't rush to defend. You don't match aggression. You let the other person reveal their position. People expose themselves when allowed to talk uninterrupted. They contradict themselves. They escalate unnecessarily. They show insecurity. Silence creates pressure. You have a choice. Let's be practical. When conflict begins, do this. Slow your breathing. Lower your voice slightly. Reduce your words by half. This immediately shifts power. The other person feels the imbalance. They expect reaction. They get restraint. That's the key. Most people believe conflict is about being understood. It's not. It's about maintaining authority over yourself. You don't need to convince someone in the moment. You need to avoid damaging your position. Some conflicts are not meant to be won verbally. They are meant to be outlasted. You have a choice. Emotional intelligence in conflict also means knowing when not to engage. Not every challenge deserves a response. Not every insult deserves defense. Not every disagreement deserves debate. Engaging emotionally with low-level conflict lowers your status. Silence is sometimes the strongest response. That's the key. Let's talk about control. Control in conflict does not come from force. It comes from non-reactivity. When you don't react, the other person must adjust. They either calm down or escalate further. Either way, they reveal their level. You learn who you're dealing with. You have a choice. Here's another uncomfortable truth. Most conflicts escalate because both people want to feel right. That desire is emotional, and it's expensive. If you give up the need to be right, you gain the ability to be effective. Effectiveness beats correctness. That's the key. High performers enter conflict with one goal: protect clarity. Not pride, not image, not ego. Clarity. They ask internally, what outcome do I want? Does this response move me towards it? If the answer is no, they don't say it. You have a choice. Let's talk about emotional bait. Some people don't want resolution. They want reaction. They provoke. They exaggerate. They accuse emotionally. If you take the bait, you lose position. If you stay calm, they lose momentum. That's the key. Here's a powerful sentence to use in conflict. I hear you. Not to agree, not to surrender, to neutralize escalation. Feeling heard lowers emotional intensity. Once intensity drops, control returns. You have a choice. Emotional intelligence in conflict is not softness, it is precision. You choose timing, you choose words, you choose silence when necessary. You don't swing wildly, you strike deliberately, or not at all. That's the key. Let's address aftermath. After conflict, emotional people replay it endlessly. They rehearse arguments, they relive emotion. Disciplined people review it once. They ask, what worked? What didn't? What do I train next time? Then they move on. No rumination, no emotional residue. That's mastery. Here's the reality. Conflict is inevitable. Loss of control is optional. You will face pressure. You will face provocation. You will face disagreement. The question is not if you feel emotion. The question is who decides next, emotion or you? You have a choice. Let me anchor this. In conflict, the calm person sets the frame. The reactive person plays inside it. Never be the one reacting. You now understand how emotional intelligence works under pressure. You don't escalate, you don't rush, you don't perform. You regulate, you observe, you decide. And this ability changes everything. But there is one mistake still holding most people back, because even after conflict, they stay emotionally weak, long after the moment is over. You've learned to control yourself in conflict. Now let's talk about the habit that keeps people emotionally weak long after the moment is over.
Most people believe feeling deeply makes them wise. It doesn't. It makes them noisy inside, and noise kills clarity. Thinking requires space. Emotion fills that space. That's the key. Let's be precise. This chapter is not about becoming cold. It's not about suppressing emotion. It's not about denying your humanity. It's about reducing emotional volume so thinking can function. Because when emotion is loud, logic is quiet. You have a choice. Emotional people live inside a storm. They feel everything intensely. They replay everything repeatedly. They magnify every interaction. As a result, their decisions are reactive. Their judgments are distorted. Their lives feel exhausting. Not because life is hard, but because their internal environment is chaotic. That's the key. Let's say something uncomfortable. Feeling everything is not strength, it's inefficiency. Your nervous system has limited capacity. When it's flooded with emotion, it cannot process information accurately. That's why emotional people overthink, assume intent, jump to conclusions, miss obvious solutions. Thinking collapses under emotional weight. You have a choice. High performers intentionally feel less, not because they don't care, but because they care about outcomes. They reduce emotional engagement so they can increase mental clarity. They don't dramatize events internally. They don't personalize neutral situations. They don't amplify discomfort into identity. They observe, they assess, they decide. That's the key. Let's break this illusion. More emotion means more truth. No. More emotion often means less accuracy. Emotion exaggerates. Emotion distorts. Emotion narrows perspective. Clear thinking requires emotional restraint. Say it clearly. It's not about feeling more. It's about thinking better. Most people confuse sensitivity with intelligence. They say, I'm very aware because I feel deeply. Feeling deeply without control creates vulnerability, not wisdom. Awareness requires distance. Distance requires emotional containment. You cannot analyze a situation you are emotionally drowning in. You have a choice. Let's talk about rumination. Rumination is emotional overprocessing. You replay conversations. You imagine alternate responses. You relive moments again and again. This is not problem solving. It's emotional indulgence. It drains energy. It clouds judgment. It keeps you stuck. High performers cut rumination early. That's the key. Here's a powerful rule. If thinking doesn't lead to action, stop thinking. Endless emotional analysis is not insight. It's avoidance disguised as reflection. Ask yourself, what decision does this require? What action moves this forward? If there's no action, close the loop. You have a choice. Feeling less also means personalizing less. Not everything is about you. Not every comment is an attack. Not every delay is disrespect. Emotional people take neutral events personally. Disciplined people check assumptions. They ask, what evidence do I actually have? What else could explain this? This widens perspective. That's the key. Let's talk about emotional exaggeration. Emotion speaks in extremes. Always, never, everything, nothing. These words are emotional, not factual. High performers eliminate extreme language internally. They replace it with specifics. Not, this is a disaster, but this is inconvenient.
Not "they disrespected me," but "they disagreed." Language shapes thinking. Thinking shapes behavior. You have a choice. Here's a daily discipline you must adopt. When emotion spikes, ask, what are the facts? What am I assuming? What is within my control? This separates reality from emotion. That's the key. Feeling less also improves timing. Emotional people act immediately. Disciplined people act correctly. They delay action until emotion settles, not because they're indecisive, but because they respect accuracy. They know this truth. A delayed, intelligent response beats an immediate, emotional one. You have a choice. Let's address empathy. Feeling less does not mean caring less. It means caring selectively. You don't absorb everyone's emotion. You don't carry other people's chaos. You don't take responsibility for feelings you didn't create. This protects your mental bandwidth. That's the key. High performers guard their mental energy fiercely. They don't let every situation become emotional. They don't let every opinion penetrate. They don't let every mood dictate focus. They understand mental clarity is a competitive advantage. You have a choice. Let's talk about decision-making. Every important decision requires emotional neutrality. Not excitement, not fear, not anger. Neutrality. Emotional highs distort risk. Emotional lows exaggerate danger. Disciplined people wait for emotional flatness before committing. That's the key. Here's a truth most people never learn. The less emotional weight you attach to things, the more options you see. Emotion narrows choices. Clarity expands them. And options create power. You have a choice. Feeling less also shortens recovery time. Emotional people stay stuck for days. Disciplined people recover quickly. Why? Because they don't dramatize setbacks. They ask, what's next? What do I adjust? What do I execute? Then they move. That's the key. Let's anchor this chapter. You don't need to feel everything. You don't need to react to everything. You don't need to emotionally process every detail. You need clarity. And clarity comes from emotional restraint. Say this clearly and often. I reduce emotion to increase intelligence. This is not suppression. This is strategy. Not numbness, precision. You now understand how to quiet the internal noise. But clarity alone is not enough. Because there is one emotional mistake that destroys more progress than any other. It masquerades as strength, but it drains power silently. And that's what we dismantle next. You've learned to feel less and think better. Now let's talk about the discipline that separates emotional weakness from mastery.
Most people believe feeling deeply makes them wise. It doesn't. Detachment is misunderstood. Most people hear the word and think of indifference, coldness, emotional distance. That misunderstanding keeps them weak, because detachment is not the absence of care. It is the absence of emotional slavery. That's the key. Attachment is what makes emotions dangerous. When you are attached to outcomes, to approval, to being liked, to being right, emotion controls you. Detachment breaks that control. You have a choice. Let's be very clear. You can care deeply and still remain detached. You can love fully and still think clearly. You can commit completely without being emotionally dependent. Detachment means your identity is not hostage to outcomes. That's mastery. Most emotional suffering comes from attachment. Attachment to expectations, attachment to validation, attachment to how things should go. When reality disagrees, emotion explodes. Anger, disappointment, resentment. Not because the situation is tragic, but because attachment was rigid. That's the key. High performers practice strategic detachment. They invest effort, not emotional dependency. They commit to actions, not guarantees. They understand this truth. You control effort. You do not control outcomes.
Detachment aligns your emotions with reality. You have a choice. Let's talk about coldness. Coldness is emotional shutdown. Detachment is emotional regulation. Coldness avoids feeling. Detachment chooses when to feel. Coldness is fear-based. Detachment is discipline-based. One is numb. The other is precise. That's the key. Emotional people attach their self-worth to results. If they win, they feel worthy. If they lose, they feel broken. This creates emotional volatility. Disciplined people detach self-worth from outcomes. They measure themselves by process, not applause, by effort, not approval. This stabilizes emotions. You have a choice. Let's address relationships. Detachment does not mean distance. It means boundaries. You don't chase attention. You don't beg for understanding. You don't overextend emotionally. You offer presence, not desperation. People respect boundaries more than neediness. That's the key. Attachment also fuels overreaction. When something matters too much, you lose perspective. You interpret small issues as major threats. You react to minor setbacks dramatically. Detachment restores proportion. It allows you to ask, is this worth my energy? Will this matter in a week? Does this require action or acceptance? You have a choice. High performers detach from other people's emotions. They don't absorb moods. They don't carry others' stress. They don't confuse empathy with responsibility. You can understand someone's feelings without making them yours. This protects mental clarity. That's the key. Let's be practical. When something doesn't go your way, say internally, I did my part. I'll adjust if needed. I'm not defined by this. This simple script breaks emotional spirals. Detachment is trained through language. You have a choice. Most people fear detachment because they think it means losing motivation. It doesn't. Detachment improves motivation. Why? Because motivation rooted in emotion is unstable. Motivation rooted in discipline is reliable. You don't need emotional highs to perform. You need commitment. That's the key. Detachment also improves resilience. When you're detached, failure doesn't crush you. It informs you. Feedback replaces drama. Adjustment replaces rumination. You recover faster. That's mastery. Let's talk about control again. If something can emotionally destroy you, it controls you. Detachment removes that leverage. You become difficult to manipulate, difficult to provoke, difficult to destabilize. Not because you don't care, but because you care intelligently. You have a choice. High performers detach from praise as well. Praise inflates ego. Ego creates blind spots. They accept compliments, but they don't depend on them. They return to process. This keeps identity stable. That's the key. Detachment also creates focus. When you stop emotionally clinging, your attention sharpens. You stop worrying about perception. You stop monitoring reactions. You stop managing impressions. Energy returns to execution. You have a choice. Here's a powerful truth. Attachment is emotional noise. Detachment is clarity. Noise distracts. Clarity directs. And direction determines results. That's the key. Let's anchor this chapter. Detachment is not withdrawal. It is not apathy. It is not coldness. It is self-command. You decide where emotion goes. You decide how much it weighs. You decide what deserves energy. Say this clearly. I care, but I am not controlled. Repeat it, because this sentence protects your identity. You now understand detachment. You can care without clinging, act without attachment, commit without dependency. But mastery requires more than understanding. It requires training. Because emotional discipline must hold when pressure is high. And that's what we build next. You've learned detachment. Now let's talk about how to train emotional control until it becomes automatic.
Understanding yourself is not optional. It is the foundation of power, clarity, and freedom. When you master your emotions, you stop begging for validation. You stop reacting to noise. You stop giving your energy to chaos. You pause. You observe. You decide. This is emotional intelligence, not softness, command. Now here is your challenge. For the next 30 days, do not react immediately to anything. Pause. Name the emotion. Choose your response. Do this and you will become someone who cannot be rushed, cannot be provoked, and cannot be controlled. Understanding yourself changes everything. Now go practice it.